Today, I saw it on my new passport mail. So now to specify, my gender markers were first changed in my teens when I first got my driver's license, and then passports following all have been female since.
This time, we're going to be looking at this really interesting story about Hunter Schafer.
Oh, yeah.
The actress from Euphoria. She had this kind of crazy thing happen with her passport.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how this seemingly simple thing, like a passport, can kind of open up all these much larger questions about identity
Right.
and how gender is represented officially and things like that.
Yeah, so Schafer, she shared on TikTok that her new passport lists her as male even though she identifies as female.
All right.
And this is especially confusing because she had applied with the correct gender marker after losing her old passport.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder how something like that could even happen.
Well, and it's not just like a mix-up or an accident. What happened with her passport is actually a direct result of those policy changes that happened during the Trump administration.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was this one specific executive order that said sex assigned at birth is the only thing that can determine gender markers on any official document.
Wow. So even though she identifies as female and she applied with that marker, it was still changed because of this order.
Yeah, that's right.
So essentially, it seems like regardless of how you identify or, even what you put on your application, your passport might not accurately reflect who you are.
Right, and you can imagine what kind of situations that could create, especially at like airport security.
Oh, absolutely.
Having to explain this to Border Patrol every time you travel,
Yeah.
it forces you to out yourself and explain this really personal thing over and over again, which can be so uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah, and not to mention feel really unsafe.
Yeah, she even mentioned feeling worried about that in her video,
Yeah.
And it seemed like she really wanted to raise awareness about this whole thing.
Right.
She even said, quote, "This is real and it's happening. No one, no matter how wealthy, white, or pretty, is excluded."
That's a powerful statement, right? It highlights how this isn't just some, theoretical debate. This is having real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And I think it also kind of connects to this even bigger issue about how valid is it to rely only on sex assigned at birth for these legal documents?
For sure. Yeah.
Can you kind of break that down for us a bit more? What exactly does that mean, sex assigned at birth?
Yeah, so sex assigned at birth, that basically means the sex a doctor designates for a baby based on what they see, like the external anatomy at birth.
Okay.
And then a gender marker, that's what you see on official documents like the MRF, on passports and driver's licenses.
Got it.
And the problem is that those two things aren't always the same, especially for transgender individuals.
Right.
Because a person's internal sense of their own gender identity can be totally different from the sex they were assigned at birth. And forcing that disconnect onto legal documents just creates this situation where the document doesn't really reflect who that person is.
Right. Yeah, it kind of seems like having a document that's just wrong.
Yep, exactly.
I mean, especially for someone like Schafer who travels internationally. She needs her passport to accurately reflect who she is.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because her situation actually brings up another important point.
Okay.
So Trump's executive order that we were talking about,
Yeah.
that also reversed the previous policy that actually allowed for an ex-gender marker on passports.
But wasn't that option put in place during the Biden administration?
Yes, that's right.
And I thought that was for people who identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming.
Exactly.
So basically now, if you don't fit neatly into male or female,
Right.
there's literally no option to have your identity recognized on official documents.
Exactly. You're just kind of left out.
It seems like something as simple as a passport has kind of become a flashpoint for all these bigger questions about how we understand and recognize gender, right?
Right.
But what does all of this actually mean for people, on a practical level?
Right.
What could happen if you have a gender marker that doesn't match how you live and present yourself in the world?
Well, on a practical level, it can create a lot of problems, especially when you're traveling. Imagine presenting your passport, like you said, at a hotel or a bank or anywhere official, and the gender marker doesn't match how you look.
Right.
It could raise suspicions, you might get questioned, you could even be denied service.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
It's almost like having this document that doesn't really represent who you are.
Exactly.
And I imagine that could be incredibly frustrating, maybe even lead to some discriminatory situations.
For sure, yeah. And it kind of creates this ripple effect, you know? It affects your sense of safety and your well-being.
Yeah.
You know, constantly having to explain yourself or justify your identity can be really exhausting.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it makes you feel vulnerable, especially if you're traveling somewhere new.
Schafer even used the term clocked. Is that the right term?
Yes.
I mentioned worrying about potentially being harassed or facing violence because her passport doesn't match her gender presentation.
Right, and clocked basically means when someone's transgender identity is revealed, you know, often without their consent.
Right.
And unfortunately, it can lead to discrimination or even violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and having a passport that basically outs you can increase that risk, especially if you're traveling in a country that's not so progressive about gender identity.
It's crazy to think about how something like this seemingly bureaucratic issue can actually have such serious and real consequences on people's lives.
Absolutely. And it kind of brings us back to that main question of like, how much do government policies really impact our identities? Because having your identity legally recognized and affirmed through documents, that's incredibly important, you know?
It's like saying, this is who I am.
Right.
And having society acknowledge and validate that.
Exactly. And when that recognition is denied or it's made difficult, it can really affect how you feel about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking bigger picture here, how does the way the U.S. does gender markers on passports compare to other countries?
That's a great question. There's actually a pretty big global movement going on towards more inclusive passport policies.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of countries like Canada, Australia, and a bunch in Europe, they already have a third gender option like an X on their passports for people who don't identify as male or female.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's great, right?
So those countries are recognizing that gender's way more nuanced than just a simple binary.
Yeah.
That's a huge step.
It is.
What are some of the arguments in favor of those more inclusive policies?
Well, advocates say it's really a matter of human rights.
Okay.
You know, everyone deserves to have their identity accurately reflected on official documents.
Right.
It's about respecting individual autonomy, the right to decide for yourself who you are.
Right, and on a practical level, it probably makes travel safer and easier for
Exactly.
people who are transgender and non-binary.
For sure. Yeah. And I think another argument that really resonates with me is that it's about recognizing that human experience is diverse, you know? So by expanding gender options on passports, it's like we're saying we we see you, we respect the fact that there are all different kinds of gender identities out there.
It's like moving away from trying to fit everyone into these little boxes and instead just acknowledging everyone's unique identity.
Exactly.
That seems like a really positive step towards a more inclusive society.
Absolutely. And, you know, this whole conversation isn't just about passports.
Yeah.
It's happening with other documents, too, like driver's licenses and birth certificates.
Really?
There's a big movement to make all kinds of identification more inclusive.
That's great.
Yeah, it is. It's exciting.
So it seems like this whole thing with Schafer's passport is kind of a small example of this much bigger global shift in how we understand and think about gender.
Absolutely.
But then here in the U.S., getting rid of the X marker option feels like we're going backwards.
Yeah, you're totally right.
It kind of highlights how policy decisions, even about just one document, can reflect these much bigger social and political trends.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really important to be aware of these trends and to think about how they might affect people's lives.
Absolutely. So what does all this mean for people like Schafer and for other trans and non-binary folks who are dealing with these really complex systems?
Yeah.
What can they do to stand up for themselves and for more inclusive policies?
That's a great question, and one that I think we should dive into a little bit deeper after a quick break. So, you know, before the break, we were talking about those challenges that trans and non-binary folks face when dealing with government policies and like official documents and all that.
Right. What advice do you have for those people who are kind of like in that situation, you know, navigating all of that?
Yeah, well, first off, it's super important to just know your rights.
Okay.
And understand the specific policies in your country or your state. There's usually legal resources and advocacy groups that can help.
Okay.
Like the National Center for Transgender Equality and the Transgender Law Center. Those are both really good resources.
Got it. So basically having that information can help people advocate for themselves.
Exactly. And speaking of advocating, you know, it's so important to make your voice heard.
Right.
You know, contact your elected officials, share your experiences, and push for policies that are more inclusive. You know, policy change a lot of times happens because of grassroots organizing.
Right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times it can feel really daunting to speak out about these things, but
Yeah,
even small actions can make a difference.
totally.
I mean, Schafer sharing her story on TikTok is a great example
Absolutely.
of how using your platform,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how big or small it is,
Right.
can raise awareness and get these important conversations started.
Exactly. I mean, for her to speak out like that, she's a celebrity.
Right.
She could face backlash for it. It's really brave and inspiring, and
Yeah.
it shows the power of social media,
Right.
for getting those marginalized voices out there.
Absolutely. And it also shows that even someone like Shaker, who's, successful in the public eye,
Yeah,
she still has to deal with these challenges.
right.
It really emphasizes that this isn't just some niche issue.
Yeah.
This affects people from all walks of life.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that the fight for equality and recognition is not over.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and relax. We have to keep pushing for change.
Absolutely. So to kind of wrap up our deep dive today,
Yeah.
what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember that even something as basic as a passport
Right.
can be this battleground for identity
Yeah.
and recognition.
Mhm.
It shows us that these policy decisions have real world impacts on people, and that we all have a responsibility to fight for systems that are fair,
Right.
just and inclusive of everyone.
That's a really great point. And to our listeners out there,
Yeah,
we really encourage you to keep learning about this topic,
absolutely.
challenge your own assumptions,
Mhm.
and find ways to make a difference in your own communities.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
So before the break, we were discussing the emotional impact
Right.
of constantly having to explain or defend your identity.
Yeah, it must be exhausting.
It really is. It can make you feel like even simple things like traveling are stressful and just a huge burden.
Right, because it impacts your sense of freedom.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about some solutions.
Okay.
What can governments and policymakers do to make things better?
Well, one big step would be to get rid of the binary system altogether.
Okay.
A lot of countries are already doing that. They're using a third gender option, usually an X,
Right.
for people who don't identify as strictly male or female.
Yeah, that seems like a good step.
Yeah, it's definitely a step in the right direction.
But even that doesn't really capture the full spectrum of gender identity, right?
Yeah, that's true. Even the X option still tries to put people into categories when gender is often much more fluid and complex than that.
Are there any approaches that go beyond these categories?
There are. Some people are suggesting we just get rid of gender markers on documents completely.
Wow, really?
Yeah, they argue that gender often isn't relevant to the purpose of the document anyway.
That's interesting.
And including, it just opens the door for discrimination and privacy issues.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It would require us to really rethink how we use these documents, but it could be a more inclusive and equitable approach in the long run.
I like that.
Yeah.
This whole conversation just shows how important it is to keep talking about this stuff.
Absolutely. We can't let we have to keep questioning these systems and keep pushing for change.
Yeah, and we have to listen to the people who are most affected by these policies.
Exactly. Their voices need to be at the center of this conversation.
Well said. So as we wrap up today, what's the one thing you'd like our listeners to remember?
I think it's important to remember that this isn't just a transgender issue or a non-binary issue. This is about basic human rights. It's about respecting everyone and making sure everyone feels seen and valued for who they truly are.
That's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And I think it's a call to action for all of us
Mhm.
to be more aware, more informed, and more involved in creating a better world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us today on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep learning and exploring these really important issues.